I am an associate professor at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and I study the genetics and genomics of asthma, COPD, and other lung diseases. And I've been here now for about 15 years, and I arrived when I was just starting my postdoctoral training and beginning my academic career. And what I try and do in this lecture, and I'm going to keep the lecture notes themselves relatively brief so we can spend a lot of time on questions, is to present to you my understanding of what it really takes to make it in an academic medical career, how to leverage the resources at your disposal and to look for the right type of venues to, make things work for you and to be successful. And so the way we're going to do this is that I will spend about 15-20 minutes going over some slides, and this is really to foster some ideas in your mind to then be able to ask whatever questions you would like. If there are topics that I don't bring up in the lecture slides, that doesn't mean that they're not important. You should feel free to ask those questions regardless. So with that, I'll begin by saying this. Oh, the slide didn't advance. So many of you may just be finishing your medical training or be in the beginnings of research portion of your career or starting on as an early faculty member and thinking about how you can make an impact. And for many people, going through medical school, residency, and fellowship feels very secure, that you're on a fairly predestined path, much like a set of very stable train tracks, and that one goes from one transition point to the next. While there are some decisions that one has to make, the path is pretty well laid out. The problem, however, is that when one starts to develop your own research career, things start diverging and becoming very much more personal and tailored to your needs, desires, aspirations. And what we all worried about is, in fact, that this is going to occur. And I cannot tell you how many of my colleagues, how many of my trainees, how many of the students that I've taught in courses similar to this really recognize the emotions behind this slide and how people worry about what's going to happen in their own career, and that as soon as things are in their own hands, they will derail. Well, I can assure you that for the vast majority of people that come through the halls of academic medical institutions, this type of scenario actually does not play out. And the reason for that is that to get this far, you have to be quite capable already. The first thing is to reassure everyone that as long as you put one foot in front of the other and don't do anything particularly reckless, scenarios like this just should not happen. So when people talk about making it in academic medicine, it's really a very difficult thing to describe exactly what success is. And we don't have time to go over all of the different possible permutations, whether it be in research, whether it be in education, whether it be in clinical advancement, but to say that regardless of which avenue you choose, the success is really to be defined by you achieving your personal goals. I think it's very important to realize that you will never please everyone, and you will never be thought of as phenomenal by absolutely every possible judge. The feelings of success have to be driven from within. So I already mentioned that there are three broad research tracks, three broad academic tracks, research, clinical, and education. And really all of what I'm going to talk about now really applies to all three avenues, but I will be placing more of an emphasis on trying to develop a research career. So when I give this lecture, and when I put together these slides, I think to myself what somebody in your position might be most concerned about. And so I think back to when I first transitioned from my clinical training to my research training back about 15 years ago. And at that time, I had finished my clinical training, but I had absolutely no research experience at all, no publication records, and I had no grants. And yet, within 15 years, I now have established myself with an independent career. I have a productive laboratory, I have good grant support, and I maintain an active clinical practice. And I remember back in 2000 that I would see people who were at the stage I'm at now and ask myself, how is it that one gets from where I was to where I am? And it seemed like a really black box, a void that was unexplainable, that somehow one goes from being inexperienced and not funded and not someone with a reputation in research to having it. And of course it doesn't happen overnight, but I always wondered what could the gaps in this process be. How can this all be explained? And very often myself and colleagues of mine felt that it must be about talent, and it must be about intelligence, and it must be about a brilliant finding that will change the way people perceive of me and then give me research dollars and promotions and so on. But in fact, it has very little to do, I think, with intelligence, very little to do with having a really insightful idea or a breakthrough. What it really comes down to is a set of characteristics that are quite personal, but they include a deep motivation and belief in what you're doing, diligence and fortitude to keep at it and not to give up as the projects become more challenging, to make sure that you find yourself a very strong mentor, someone who is going to help guide you through the challenges of academic careers. You need a strong social support. I can't tell you how often I see people who become discouraged with their work, who don't have a strong set of friends or family around them to help motivate them and to keep them focused and to not get discouraged, and how many of those people go on to not succeed because it just gets to be too difficult. So having that is really important. And of course there is some good fortune to it. You have to be in the right place at the right time, but I think that most people would agree that if you establish yourself with good training, do good work, that you will be prepared for when that fortune arrives. So I'd like to now spend some time going over some of these issues in greater detail and then going into some of the issues around what it takes to succeed. So to succeed, there are really two types of resources that one needs. There are personal resources and there are material resources. And what you need to think about when looking at this slide, particularly focusing on the left-hand side of the page, is that all of you have varying degrees of these different attributes, but that there's not a single one that's more important than the other. And similarly, you really need to have a good deal of each of them. And I'll particularly point out how many of the attributes that I've listed here that have to do with your ability to work through problems, to not get discouraged when you come up against challenges, and to not give up in the work that you're interested in. I really feel that of all of the determinants of whether or not someone is going to make it or not is whether or not they are willing to go through a wall to get their work done to succeed in their career, and that they will not be denied that ambition. It's really important because there are so many people that are going to put obstacles in your way, either intentionally or very often completely unintentionally. And you have to be able to navigate that and to understand that when you get back a bad review on a paper or a bad review on a grant, that it's just a review and that it's a set of opinions, and you can take some constructive criticism from it, but you have to have the fortitude to say, I'm not going to be deterred, and I'm going to move forward with my work. The material resources on the right side of the slide are very important as well. However, they are not things that you can often control at the outset of your career development. You need to rely on other people to provide you with these resources. And so really, of all the things on the right-hand side, the most important is the last, and that is the mentors, who can help provide you at the outset with some of these other resources to get you started and to support you through your early days. We'll go over more of this as we go forward. So of all of the personal resources listed on the left-hand side, many people would assume that because this is academics we're talking about and research, that the most important of all of these attributes is intelligence. And I'll tell you that off the bat, I actually don't think that that is the case at all. And I'd like to explain why. So here are two figures that display the distributions of IQs, intelligence quotients, and which is one of many metrics, standardized metrics that tells us something about a person's intellectual capacity. On the right is the normal distribution of IQs in the general population, and on the left is a graphical display of the distribution of IQs in different professions. And what you can see is that physicians and physician equivalents, people who have medical degrees or the equivalents, so PhDs, have the highest IQs and are skewed the most in terms of the distribution. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see that the overwhelming majority of MDs have very high IQs, well above the 50th percentile of the population. The reason I put this up is because once you get into the higher quartiles of intelligence, things become very difficult to differentiate. And someone being slightly more intelligent in one set of avenues may have deficiencies in others. And so really being in medicine or being a PhD in biomedical research is a form of a selective process that already picks out people who are skewed to have this level of intelligence. And so among those people, there must be other attributes that differentiate those who go on to have successful and productive careers as compared to those who may not and may fail. So for me, intelligence is kind of a non-starter. You have to have it to get in the door, but once you're in, you have to look elsewhere. And there are a number of books that have been written discussing the issue of innate abilities, whether it be intelligence or whether it be talent. And what most of these studies and the books that have been written based on many of these different studies and vignettes is that indeed talent itself is very overrated, and that the way one succeeds is actually by following all of the different recommendations that are on the right-hand side here. So you have to hone your skills. You have to practice them. You have to, if it's in the context of doing research, you have to do a lot of studies so that you learn from your mistake with each study and you get better and better recognizing the patterns of success and failure within the research experiments that you do. Practice also comes in the form of writing. The more you write, the better your writing will be, the easier it will be to write. And so whether it's writing a paper or writing a grant, the more you do it, the better you will be. Showing up. It might sound silly, but it is amazing how easy it is to differentiate people who are productive from those who are not based on who's around more, who's not standing around during the day just gossiping and talking about things, but actually in their office or at their bench doing their work and being diligent about it. You have to recognize opportunities, you have to take chances, and all of those things require you having the confidence and the courage to really continue on the road that you've chosen. But I think of all of these characteristics, perhaps the most important is perseverance and patience, but perseverance in particular. Like I said before, this is a career that is often fraught with setbacks, with negative criticism from others, with bad reviews, with rejections, and you have to be willing to ignore it as best as you can, to tune out that noise and just try and continue with the work. That is not to say that you should ignore important criticisms and not try and improve based on the recommendations of experts in their field, but that you should not take the criticism so personally that it will then discourage you from pursuing your career and your ambitions further. So here I've listed a whole number of different criteria or activities or metrics that are highly thought of in academics. Some of these are related to scientific success, whether it be grant support, recognition in the newspapers. Some of them relate to what you're thought of among your peers, your academic rank, and various types of track records. If you had to choose one of these attributes that is the most highly thought of in academia in general, think to yourself for a moment which one you think is the most important. Now, when I look at this list, I certainly want to be considered kind. I certainly want to be liked by my peers. There's no question about that. Popularity, I'm not so sure. But of all of these criteria, the one that is the most commonly used to evaluate someone's performance in academia is their publication record. And I can't stress to you enough how important this is. And it's important for several reasons. This is not to say that getting grants isn't important, or that being ethical isn't important. Of course it is. Being ethical is paramount. But in terms of how one is evaluated when it's time for promotions, when it's time for considerations for new grants, for being asked to present at meetings, and so on, the number one metric is by far and away publications. And I'd like to go over this a little bit to emphasize why it's so important that this be part of your focus. So authorship is a key component to your academic success for several reasons. We have an expression in the lab, not the publish or perish, but that in academia, not in life, but in academia, you are who PubMed says you are. It's very nice for you to think that you are an authority on something, but you can't be an authority if you haven't written about it. If people can't look to your written word to get an understanding of that topic. Now, you can be a local authority within your hospital, within your region. There's no question about that. But in order to be competitive for grants, in order to be invited to participate in guideline development, in consensus statements, or other opinion-making type of documentation, people need to see that you write. Now, why is it so important? Well, the role of academia, of everything we do, is to create and to disseminate new knowledge. Even if you've generated data through a experiment, a clinical trial, if you don't disseminate that knowledge that you have developed, it's as if it never was. And so if you don't write it down, it can't really properly be disseminated. Even if you go and give a lecture on your research at a large international meeting, if that is the only time the data is ever presented, it's very likely that over time that will be lost. And it really becomes as if the work was never done. Publications are really important because they represent the dissemination of knowledge. It's a very tangible work product unlike all of the other attributes that we talked about, this is one where people can actually see what you've done. It's a mark of your expertise and your authority. It's part of your permanent academic record, permanent. And very importantly, it's a peer-reviewed work. That means that other people in the field approve of the work that you've done, so that other people who are not familiar, not experts in the field, can still feel that this piece of work must be of value. Importantly, it's also an important reflection on your ability, your creativity, your commitment to the work, your ability to work with other people. So publications are, really hold a lot of intrinsic value to them. But there's another reason why publications are so important, and that's because it is the #1 academic currency. Because people put so much value on it, by writing papers, that is an important criteria for getting grants. You then get the grants to be able to ask the questions, to get the resources to ask the questions, to do the experiments and to make the discovery, and that's why we're in this to begin with. So, it's very important to understand that I always stress to my trainees and talk about this with my colleagues all the time that, when I'm on my deathbed in many, many years from now, I promise that I will not look up at my loved ones and say, I wish I wrote another paper. But in the context of your job and in the context of building a career, the ultimate focus should be on generating new knowledge and on disseminating that through high-quality publication. If there's one piece of advice I can give you all, and this is why I've spent so much time stressing this right now, is that if you put your focus on how can I develop good data to generate a good publication, you will constantly go from one success to the next. One last point. Very often people ask me, should I publish a lot of papers that are okay, or should I publish only a few papers but that they should all be landmark studies? Well, in a perfect world, I would only publish the best, greatest data in the highest impact journals. They would be quote-unquote perfect in that I've addressed every possible issue and that there are no potential flaws in the work. And I would only publish papers that would be the type that would be, cited, globally. So fundamental discovery at the level of, the discovery of the double helix, or other Nobel Prize worthy papers. And I would never publish a replication study of work that other people did. However, if I followed these ideal scenarios, which frankly, when I was starting out, I thought this is how it should always be. If I had done this, okay, I would no longer be in academic medicine. And this is not just me, but it would be true for about 99% of everybody else who's in academic medicine. And the reason for this is that had I waited to publish the most perfect papers, I would have many, 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 many fewer papers, and it would be initially, early on in my career, an insufficient number to prove to peer reviewers that I'm worthy of funding. And I would have never gotten any of the grants to which then fueled the, my further research, much of which led to, much more impactful papers. However, this doesn't mean that you should publish, minimally important papers or papers that have very questionable results. In fact, you have to have some, very fundamental principles by which you govern your writing. And so I say to myself, I know I need to publish, but I will not violate any of these rules. I won't send out something that I don't believe to be true. I won't send out a paper that I don't think is complete enough to tell a story that would be of relevance to the readership. And the way I really sum that up is by saying I would never write a paper that I myself wouldn't want to read. If it's something that I myself don't think would be worthy of citing in a grant or citing in another paper, or something that I think would be of importance for my colleagues to know about, then I won't publish that. And importantly, if I think I'm onto something that could lead to one of these more high-impact papers, I may wait a few months to generate the additional data necessary to get that better paper out there. So by doing this, I've left several papers on the table. I haven't published every single piece of data I've ever generated. And some of those have resulted by holding back may have delayed a little bit of short-term advancement. But I sleep very well knowing that every paper that I've put out I feel very good about. And I can stand by my publication record. And I think that if you follow these principles, you'll do very well for yourself. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip over one or two slides just so that we can get to some discussions. The last few minutes, I'd like to talk about how to put yourself in the position to succeed. And of all the things that I mentioned earlier in terms of resources, the first most important thing you need to do is to make sure that you have the right boss, the right mentor, the right principal investigators to work with. This is so important because of the reliance that you will have on these people early on in your career. They will help provide you with the resources you need. They will provide you with intellectual guidance. They will provide you with emotional guidance potentially. They will help you navigate things politically. Very often you don't want to have to deal early on in your career with major administrative issues. The people who are competent in directing their labs should be the ones doing that, leaving you the time to actually do the work and make the discovery. So how do you go about finding the right person to work with? Well, unfortunately, very often at any given institution or in any given city, there might be a limited number of people who are suitable in your particular field of interest. And so I put here a number of criteria that I think you should use when evaluating. But it may be that for your particular field of interest, there is nobody who meets all of these criteria. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't find the right boss, the right mentor. Because in fact, if you can find somebody who has all of these attributes, even if they are not themselves focused on what you are interested in working on, if they have an interest in you, they can help shepherd you even while you're developing your own work. And so what you want to do is find somebody who you respect, you trust, who you think and figure out can help make your success a priority. And if you find that type of person, even if the work they're doing isn't exactly what you were planning on focusing on, as long as you can get the training and the room to grow and to develop your projects, you should think very hard about finding that right person. Remember, nobody's perfect. You have to understand that each possible boss or mentor has strengths and limitations. And once you recognize somebody's limitations, you need to work with them and navigate around those problems and try not to butt heads frequently. The next most important thing, once you've found the right avenue, the right venue, the right person, is to make sure you acquire the skills you need to do good research. You must invest the time in getting the best training in contemporary state-of-the-art research techniques. You have to read as much as possible to really learn the field and all aspects of it. You want to take coursework when appropriate, and you want to keep doing lots and lots of research, both to gain the publication experience, but also just to get the deliberate practice experience of learning how to write and learning how to do experiments and learning how to interpret results. During this training period, you must make sure that you write at least one paper and have it supervised by somebody who knows how to write papers. And similarly, if possible, you must learn how to write a grant by working with people who've done it successfully. Because if you don't learn how to do that while you're a trainee, it becomes very hard to learn how to do it when you're counting on every single grant to fund your career and to sustain you. Okay. The last thing I want to focus on here is that it's really important to know the core aspects of your job. When you're doing research, the focus should be on thinking up projects, doing the experiments, analyzing the data, and writing it up. And then publishing these papers and then writing grants. That is the core job of an academic researcher. Again, if you're going down an educational track or a clinical track, it's a little bit different. But for academic research, that is the core job. Okay? At the bottom, I list some false gods, things that people think are the illustrious part of the career and what people value, like going on the lecture circuit, talking to the media, presenting at international meetings, and so on. But in fact, if you focus on the things on the upper portion of the screen, you will succeed. If you focus on the things on the lower end of the screen, you might have one or two early successes and gain some notoriety, but it'll turn into 15 minutes of fame rather than a substantial, productive, contributive career. So I'd like to end here by saying that it's important for you to know your strengths and to then build on those strengths, and then to recognize that not everybody is perfect, even you, and that you have some weaknesses that you need to recognize. And when you find those weaknesses, one of the best ways to counter them is to build a team around you, to find colleagues to work with who can complement you and pick up the slack where your weakness is. So if you're not fantastic early on at writing, work with somebody who's a really good writer and learn from them. If you are not strong in statistical analysis, make sure you find yourself a competent statistician who understands your strengths and can work with you properly on conducting those projects. I'll end by saying that there are two books that expand on a lot of what I've discussed here. One of them was written literally 99 years ago, Advice for a Young Investigator. And it is a superb book, even today, talking about many of the things we've discussed and many more. More recently, last year, E.O. Wilson wrote Letters to a Young Scientist. It, too, is a phenomenal text. Both are relatively short reads and will provide you with a lot of very good advice and guidance as you move forward. So with that, I'd like to stop and provide all of you with the opportunity to ask whatever questions you have. I hope this has been helpful and will stimulate some discussion. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. We do have some questions already. I'm sending over the first one via the chat box.
So the first question is, how can we start our own investigations considering the very low number of publications and research conducted in our region and our lack of training in research? So this is a really great question, and I would say that it's not specific to one part of the world. Even in a place where there is tons of research going on and lots of resources, for every new investigator, for every young person, you have to make your own world and you have to make your own career. And so even for someone here, it can be challenging. So let me give you some suggestions. One of the great things about being an academic researcher who's also a physician is that every day when you see patients, you have an opportunity to ask new questions and to make observations that haven't been made before. I find that the most powerful way to build an early career is to leverage the opportunities you have right in front of you. So it might begin with making an observation in one or two patients and then doing a relatively informal study on a larger series of those patients. If you characterize the patients properly, if you can describe the phenomenon that you are curious about and can characterize that in a way that has not been put into the literature before, you should be able to get a publication, an early publication, as a proof of concept of the ideas that you're interested in studying. Armed with that, and even before you have a publication, armed with the initial data, you then need to seek out people who can help you move that agenda forward. So this is what I was referring to earlier about finding the right mentor. Just as an example, if in your region there are only 1 or 2 people who are doing scientific research, and it's not in the area that you're interested in, it's going to be very difficult for you to do everything by yourself. You would need to turn to one of those people who've had success in their area. It might be in a completely different area, and to ask them for the guidance to make the next step forward. They may know of people locally or more broadly who may be able to provide you with the resources that you need. Of course, none of this can be done in isolation, and if you're in an institution that isn't going to be able to provide any support whatsoever and doesn't have any of this infrastructure, then you really have to think about, you know, how you can work with people elsewhere, maybe by contributing your samples to a larger study early on, and to work with another institution more remotely who does have that resources. And then as you build success from these initial startings, you can then, you know, move to larger and larger projects. You have to start somewhere. And so that's why I put up that slide of how when I began 15 years ago, I had no publications. And when I wrote my first grant, I actually wrote it before I had any publications. And the review I got back was that very smart idea, it's a nice project, he has a good mentor, it looks like it might work, but this guy hasn't written anything. And I vowed after getting that review that I would never let that happen to me again. And so I just focused on writing and writing and writing. And my initial publications, they were not groundbreaking, but after writing 2 or 3 papers that contributed to the literature, I then was able to, you know, resubmit the grant, and that criticism was no longer there. So you have to start small, you have to walk before you can run, and really try and pick out one interesting thing to start with and build off of that. So next question is, how do I have balance between a successful clinical practice and a research specialty for someone who's doing the residency and the fellowship? This is also something that I'm asked very often, and I too had to, had to deal with this. I think balance is a very important issue, not only between clinical and research, but also between your work and your home life. But specifically talking about balancing the clinical practice and the research, and doing this during your training, I would say the following. You only have one opportunity during your training to get the clinical skills you need that are going to last you your lifetime. You'll always have to do continuing education, but it's that fundamental core of knowledge and experience that you're going to get during your clinical training that is going to carry with you forever. And so what I suggest to most people is that while you're doing your clinical training, that should be the major focus of your thoughts and of your energies. That during that period, you can lay the groundwork, in my impression, for a research career. For example, by writing up a case series of patients or starting to collect some patient samples to do some research. But during the clinical days, when you're up late during your residency and where you're studying for exams during your fellowship and where you're trying to learn how to run a service and all of these things, it's very difficult to, on top of that, start developing a research career. What I did was really focus very strongly on my clinical training. And once I finished that portion and had some time to do some research, I dedicated all of my energies then to really learning how to be a good researcher. And one of the best pieces of advice I received at that time was someone who said to me, it took you 8 years minimum to become a doctor and to get some basic residency training. One can't expect that you're going to become a world-class scientist overnight. You have to then invest the time and the efforts in that. And so for most of my fellows who come through my lab and most other people on campus, we try and encourage them that while you're doing your clinical training, focus on becoming the best doctor you can be, and then focus, very narrowly on a specific research interest and develop the skills around that. I think it's very difficult to multitask early on. Later it becomes a bit easier. So in my particular case, when I finished my clinical training, I then dedicated myself to acquiring research skills over about a 2-year period. During that time, I restricted the amount of clinical work that I did to the absolute minimum to make sure that I had enough of a salary to support myself, and so that my division would support me in the work I was doing. But it was only after 2 years of really getting the research off the ground that I then started building up my clinical practice as well, extending the number of weeks of consultation that I did in the hospital and so on. And you really have to give yourself the patience and the time to really develop both. I will say that from a financial point of view, there is no question that in the early days you are going to have to make somewhat of a sacrifice in terms of the number of dollars that you can earn if you're going to do additional training and research, and if you're going to be relying initially on training grant type of salaries and so on. But over time, you should be able to start balancing out the two so that, I really don't view being a researcher quote-unquote sacrifice. It really bothers me when I hear people talk about how much they sacrificed to do research. You do the research because that's what you love to do. And so if that's the case, it shouldn't be really considered a sacrifice. It's true you might not be able to fly a private jet, but you probably won't be able to do that even if making a good salary as a physician itself.
Next question.
Oh, thanks for the wonderful talk. Well, I appreciate that. But what are the alternatives if we don't have a mentor available? Well, that is a problem. I don't want to minimize the importance of having people around you who can give you some good advice. Mentors come in different forms. The model that I described was sort of a hybrid between a mentor and a boss, which very often is the case. But in fact, sometimes the mentors don't have to be the people for whom you work or the people with whom you work on projects. A mentor is really somebody who can give you advice, and that advice is really focused on you. It's not based on what their needs are. So, in fact, sometimes a boss is not the best of mentors because there might be a conflict of interest. So, what I mean, so I think there's two issues here. If you're asking the question about what do I do if I don't have somebody who can provide me with resources, there aren't resources, I would say that you need to talk to people at your institution who have some resources or capabilities to provide you with some structure, and to work with them to see what is available. And if the institution that you're at just doesn't have any support for you or isn't willing to support you, then you really have to think about how realistic it is to be able to pursue your ventures where you are. It's not that it's not possible. It'll just take a lot more work on your part to beg, borrow, and steal to get, your endeavors off the ground. But even in that situation, if it's up to you to do a lot of the legwork and that there isn't an infrastructure to support you and you're working on that, you still should seek out somebody who you trust, who you think can provide you with very sound advice. And that person doesn't have to be at your institution. That with technology today, you can Skype with somebody literally around the world. And so it's probably worthwhile talking to your colleagues. It's probably worthwhile investing in going to one of the larger international meetings and networking and meeting people who might, be able to turn into one of those mentors. And what you're really looking for is someone who is experienced, who can give you the advice and the guidance you need as you move forward, who will be able to tell you, you can bounce an idea off them, tell them what you're thinking about a project, and they can kind of tell you, I don't think that's a great idea. I'm worried for you by going down this road. I think you might want to consider changing this. Or they might say, I love that idea, but you really need to think about making sure you don't fall into this trap, etc., etc. So again, it doesn't have to be somebody who you work with daily, but you definitely should seek out somebody who can give you, advice along the way. How important is an MPH degree in academic career? I would say that once you have a medical degree or a PhD, that any additional degree is really not important at all, in my opinion. Some people think that to succeed in academia today, you need to have both an MD and a PhD, or an MD and a master's. The truth is, if you do great work and you have been well trained and you publish in strong journals and you are competitive with grants, you will never be denied a promotion or a good academic position simply because you didn't get a second degree. Having said that, I did get a second degree. I got a master's in public health and did that not to have the letters after my name, but rather to get the coursework. Because again, I came from a place where I didn't have any background in scientific training, and so I had to acquire these skills later on. And so, I found it very important to take the courses. It never, I didn't give one second thought to whether or not I would get the degree or not. It was more a matter of, am I acquiring the information? So if you can do the coursework without getting a degree, without formally applying to a program, if you get a set of texts and syllabuses and you build up the your knowledge base by going through those materials, a lot of it can be self-taught. However, it doesn't hurt to get some of that formal rigorous training as well. So it really depends on what your area's in, where you think your deficiencies lie. But to me, once you have one professional degree and one academic degree, I don't think it's necessary that it's an absolute mandatory prerequisite to have a second degree. Next question. How do you start writing a publication if you have not done it? And do the number of co-authors or including a known author help in the publication process? These are really important questions. So let me begin by the second part about the authorship. So the number of co-authors on a paper really doesn't matter, in my opinion. What matters is your position on the paper. So when we are reviewing candidates for grants or reviewing candidates for potential promotion or hiring, the most important aspects about the publication position are whether you're the first author, which suggests that you've done most of the work and written most of the manuscript, or if you're the last author, which typically is the person who oversaw the project, was the mentor, and so on. Being in the middle is not, I'm sorry, there's some background noise here. Being in the middle is not bad, but it doesn't carry the same weight as being at the front or the end. So for me, it never really bothers me when I see a paper that has multiple co-authors on it, and the more co-authors there are usually relates to how complicated the project is, usually requiring multiple sites, the collection of numerous patients from different sources, or various independent techniques, investigative techniques that have to come together to make the manuscript a success. And so to me, that's not a bad thing. But what is a bad thing is if you yourself, your publication record, only consists of multi-authored papers where you are the 12th author out of 30, those won't carry as much weight as even 1 or 2 papers where you are, the first author. In terms of who, including a known author to help in the publication process, a lot of people do this. It's not appropriate. The truth is you should only have people on the paper who have actually contributed to the work in the paper. Now, that could be a strong intellectual contribution, and so it's perfectly reasonable that if you have developed an idea and bounced it off somebody of stature and they have given you substantive help in developing it, they've helped revise the manuscript, and so on, they've helped you interpret the data, absolutely they should be an author. But to just find somebody who's well known and invite them to be on the paper so that it'll be published, many journals ban that behavior, and if it were to be flagged, I think that would be a really bad precedent for you, so I wouldn't do that. With respect to how to start writing a paper if you haven't done it before, that is really challenging, and that's another example of where mentorship really can help. But let's assume for a moment that you don't have a mentor. I'll tell you how I wrote my first paper. I was writing a genetic paper on a candidate gene. And so I went to the literature and I took the 4 or 5 most recent candidate gene studies that were published in really good journals, even if they weren't in my area of interest. And I read those papers to get an idea of how a good paper is written. I looked at how they wrote the introduction. I saw how long their introductions were, what type of information they put in the introduction. I did the same thing for the methods section. I did the same thing for the results section. I did the same thing for the discussion. And then I mimicked them. I didn't copy them because it's obviously my own data, my own work, but I took the styles from these 5 papers and then made my own. And the first draft of my paper was a little bit clumsy because it was trying to do too much, but at least I got it down on paper. Once I had the initial draft on paper and had an idea of what that looked like, I could then circulate that to my co-authors, but also to people who I trusted for them to give me feedback, and then revise the paper based on their comments. Usually the best way to start a paper is to take your results and make the tables and the figures that you're going to want to have in the paper. Make your table 1, 2, 3, 4, make figure 1, 2, 3, and then write the descriptions, the legends for those, and then write your results section. And write your results section to describe how you get to each of these figures and tables. Then you write the methods section to support the work that was done to get those results. And then you write the introduction and the discussion. And then after that, the abstract and other things follow suit. So I hope that helps explain it. Writing is never easy. Even the best writers, the people who are the most prolific, they started off as not being great writers either. You're not, like I said before, it's not a talent that you're born with. It's something that needs a lot of development. There are some people who are excellent writers of prose, of novels, of short stories. Writing scientific manuscripts is very different. It's a very different style. And so you really need to just get the practice of doing it over and over again. Without doing the clinical practice, can we continue our research career like in a research office or in a pharmaceuticals? 100% one can do that. So staying in academic medicine is only one of many different avenues to further a research career and do investigation. Many of my colleagues have transitioned out of academia and moved to pharmaceutical companies, and they are doing great work and are very happy there. There are pressures and challenges that one faces in an academic setting that you don't see in a pharmaceutical company or a biotech company, but there are other types of stresses. You know, it's a business, and businesses have to stay competitive, and so you have to be productive, and if your group is not productive, eventually there will be a cost-benefit analysis as to whether or not that work should continue. And so very often you are doing work that is not what you are primarily focused or interested in, but what is for the good of the company. But in many other cases, you can be doing work that is very creative and very innovative and supported very nicely through corporations, companies, private entities. So absolutely, I don't think that you know, one has to be in academic medicine. I do think it's important to get good training initially in a strong academic environment, because that will then serve you very well when you move into the pharmaceutical setting. It'll provide you with you know, the experiences and the expertise, the ability to critique manuscripts properly, the ability to search out and identify, you know, strong collaborators and the like. So I think a few years investment in academia is good, but by all means, if you have the right opportunity, moving into the biotech and pharma world is wonderful.
Okay, we are running out of time, but I do have 4 more questions here, if no one minds going over a little bit.
Okay. No, it's okay. Okay, at the start of our career, how beneficial is it to write more review articles in order to practice more reading and writing? Very, very good question. So writing a review article is very helpful early on for both of the reasons that you are mentioning. Writing a review article gives you practice on writing, and you will develop better writing skills by putting something like that down on paper and having it critiqued by multiple people, and then revising it and getting better and better at it with each draft. It also requires reading it quite a bit to gain knowledge in the field. And so very often what we recommend is that when I have a new fellow or a new young investigator who's interested in establishing themselves in an area, to take the time to read the literature in that area and to write it down as if they were taking notes, for example, and then to use that opportunity to compile it into a publication. Now, review articles are not viewed as highly and are not weighted in the same way that an original science manuscript is weighted when applying for grants, and in most places when applying for a job or being promoted. However, because it's helpful in accruing the knowledge and learning how to write, it can be a very, very useful exercise. The best way to leverage that is to write a review article that you can then use as the background for the introductory sections of a grant that you're writing on the same topic. That's a really efficient use of your time. And the last point I would make is that while this exercise is very helpful, okay, for the reasons I described, if all you're doing is writing review articles, you will not be successful, because it really is the original science that is the contribution that people are looking for to invest in the future. So it is a helpful tool, but it's just a tool. And you shouldn't feel very confident if you've spent 3 or 4 years working towards building a career and all you have to show for it is 1 or 2 review articles. That just won't cut it. Okay, mentors in an academic setting are usually busy and not responding to prospective graduate students. How can I find a mentor or supervisor for my postgraduate studies? Do you think there is some sort of bias in accepting PhD students? You know, people are very busy, and there are some senior people who believe that the way you make it in life is by working in somebody's lab, but by not really learning from them, and you have to make it on your own. That's not the type of mentor that I would really want to find. You really want to find somebody who's going to have time for you and put an interest in you. I would say that it's important to have a mentor that is going to be invested in you. And sometimes that mentor, the best people for that, are the people who aren't that far ahead of you that they don't remember what it was like to be in your shoes. And so finding somebody who's been successful but in academia for, let's say 10, 15 years, rather than somebody who's been around for 30 years and is very senior and may not have the time of day for anybody, that can sometimes be a very valuable way of doing things. There are some drawbacks to that approach, of course, because those people might not have as many resources, they might not have as many political connections, they might not have as much experience. And so what you might want to do is find a junior mentor who will really invest the time in you, and have that person, help you work with also a senior mentor who will spend less time with you but will be able to provide you with some of those other resources that the junior mentor can't provide. I don't think that there's a bias in accepting PhD students. In fact, I would say very often the bias might be the other way, that if somebody comes as a PhD student or a postdoc, that you will be coming with a certain set of skills that a clinician scientist may not have. And so in my group, we look for a balance of people, some PhDs, some MDs, and so that way we complement each other in that way. So I don't really think there's one major bias one way or the other. There shouldn't be anyhow. Without being associated with an institution, how can we get access to high-impact factor journals? That is very difficult. The thing I would strongly suggest is to look at PubMed Central. So PubMed is the NCBI through the federal government of the United States. It's the Center for Informatics that houses, that does the search engine for literature. PubMed Central is a subset of PubMed that consists of all of the papers that are freely accessible, that you don't need to have a subscription to read them. So by law in the United States, if you have a grant funded by the federal government, there is a mandatory requirement that the paper be made freely accessible to everybody. And that is true regardless of whether you're a U.S. citizen or not. The devil in the details is that there is a grace period where a publication does not have to be made freely available for either the first 6 months or the first year. And different journals have different requirements on this. But if you go to PubMed Central and do the same search that you would do as in PubMed, any article that is freely available will be there, and you can just click and you can get a copy of the PDF right there and then.
Last question.
Okay, if we go back with time, realizing this is now what are the kind of mistakes you really wanted to avoid at the time, what are the things that could make a big difference in your career if you had done or avoided them? Wow, that is a fantastic question. So I think if I had to go back, if I had to do anything differently, the one thing I would have done differently is I would have worried a lot less about how much of the work I felt I needed to be doing in order to call the project my own. Early on, I felt that if I wanted to be proud of myself and to feel like I had been successful, that I should really do the most of the project or all of the project. What I now realize is that the way you're the most successful is by generating data and publishing that data and generating the best data you can generate. And that might be by working with someone else and you only doing half the work, but finding the right person who can do the other half. So the minute I was able to start letting go and saying this doesn't all have to be my own work, it can be work that I'm working with somebody else and collaborating, that's when a lot of my research really started taking off. And it was a naive thought on my part that I had to, and probably an insecurity as well, you know, that I felt I had to do everything in order to prove myself. But no, you should do whatever it takes to get the best piece of work done, to make the discovery and to publish it. So that would be the biggest mistake I made, and if I could turn back time, I would definitely have done that differently. With the exception of that, there are a few papers that I was worried about publishing because I wasn't 100% sure about the data, and so that's a good thing that I didn't publish them, because you shouldn't publish if you're worried about the data. In a few of these cases, the data was right, and if I would have published, I would have published it before somebody else had published it, and I would have had a few more higher impact papers early on. But you know, like I said, I sleep pretty well feeling that I've, you know, done things, you know, fairly well. But there are a few papers that I regret that I couldn't have gotten out earlier, and I find that frustrating.
Okay.
Fantastic talk. Thanks. Well, that's very nice of you.
Thank you, Dr. Raby. I think this has been a great discussion. Lots of questions coming in and lots of students sending back feedback that this has been great. So thanks again for that wonderful talk. And thanks, everyone. This has been your last official webinar. We do have 2 review webinars coming up, but this is pretty much it. You're in the last stretch of the program now. So thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.